coming to you from deep beneath the murky waters that lie beyond the Lake Erie shoreline. This is the Cleveland Podcast! With Fred the Mud Monster and South Bay Caesar. Find us online at facebook.com/The Cleveland Podcast or email us at theclevelandpodcast@gmail.com. Now, join us as we journey through Northeast Ohio and the city of Cleveland. Hey, Fred!
We're in the middle of a library, somewhat.
It's a very cool library.
It is a very cool library. Actually, you know what I'm really appreciating are these little curtains on the wall. The nice red. It's a nice, like, royal red type of back from the days of 19th century Europe type of vibe. I'm liking that.
A chandelier above our head.
Chandelier's okay. I'm getting like a whole King Arthur type of vibe from that, except there are no candles. It's just light bulbs.
And we're surrounded by books.
You know, that's my favorite thing, though. Books have been my entire life. You know, I'd continue to read all the time.
So tell everybody where we are today.
We are in the Western Reserve Historical Society, which is a local history museum he found in Cleveland, Ohio, right near Case Western. It's only a couple minutes walk for me. And all of a sudden, we had this wonderful opportunity to interview our guest for today, who is Chad Malkamaki. Malkamaki.
Yeah, nailed it the second time.
I always takes me 3 times, like a batter. Except, you know, I always hit on strike 2. I don't hit on strike 3. So Chad Malkamaki is a visitor services manager here at the Western Reserve Historical Society. What else about you, Chad? We can't just be summarizing your story.
Basically, I oversee the day-to-day operations here, the frontline staff, help check with our education team all the school groups in, group tours, and then help cover lunch breaks throughout the day, oversee the interpretation team. But really, I've been with the museum since 2001 as a museum educator. I've also worked as an interpreter at some of our other sites that we have in the organization. And for a while, I was the education technology manager at the museum. And now I really enjoy my role of interacting with the guests on a day-to-day basis and solving all the problems that can pop up over the course of the day.
Well, that's great. So then what are some of the questions that visitors often ask?
The history of Cleveland, which we have a great exhibit called Cleveland Starts Here, which we didn't have for a while at a time. Our older core exhibit only went through Lincoln's funeral train in 1865 when it came through Cleveland. Mm-hmm. So we missed the entire 20th century. So when I started, there was plans of getting a new exhibit up and running.
Right.
And luckily, with Cleveland Starts Here, it was for our sesquicentennial, our 150th anniversary. We're Cleveland's oldest existing cultural institution. So now we have a great exhibit with over 850 artifacts that answers that question about what is Cleveland, what's the history of Cleveland. But everything from the car museum, the number of cars that we have, over 170 in the collection. On site, we probably have about 70 or 80. But a lot of people are sadly, I wish we could get more people through the doors. That you always hear, the last time I was here was for a field trip or I had a prom or a wedding, and it's been 20 years. So that's one thing we're working on, is trying to get the people to come back a lot more, and also to grow our membership as well. And the Carousel, we get a lot of families that are really coming here weekly now to have something to do with the kids. So yeah, it's really that whole thing. Or they just say we've drove past it all the years we've lived in Cleveland, and they're excited to walk in the door, and they have no clue what they're about to see.
When Fred told me that we were meeting here today, I asked him where it was, and I drive by here all the time. I should know where it's at.
And that's the story of most Clevelanders. They've lived their whole life in the city. It's not just outsiders that are new to the city, and that's one of the things we're working to get better. When you head up right up MLK past the VA hospital, we have the new great Cleveland History Center, because this location is the Cleveland History Center of the Western Reserve Historical Society. It's one of our 6 different sites throughout the 4 different counties in Northeast Ohio. And the Carousel, I mean, it's definitely helped out having the old Euclid Beach Park Carousel. And I've noticed within the last 5 years, they're starting to get, because when I started in 2001, I would say I work at the Western Reserve Historical Society. very little people knew, except if you were really involved in history or genealogy. Right. And then I'd say the Crawford Auto Aviation Museum, that might get maybe 20, 30 more % people with recognition. Mm-hmm. And then finally, I would say I work at the Car Museum, and then
everyone goes,
I know that place, but I've never been there. Yeah.
It's very strange with the naming. But I remember when I was here, it was around 2.5 years ago was the last time I was in this building for a senior thesis class because I was a history major out at Case Western. And I remember that our professor's like, okay, just look at some of the stuff. This is kind of cool. Oh, hey, there's a carousel. And we're just going to go on that. And so I'm just thinking, I'm like, wow, we have $20-something thousand in tuition, and one of our classes is just riding on a carousel. I don't know if this is worth it or not, but for now, it feels like it is. But here we are again. And it really was kind of cool because I always knew that this was always really a cool museum to be in. I just didn't do the due diligence of coming back after my senior year, but I knew this was a good opportunity. And we reached out, and all of a sudden we get to this point. And it was just such a thrill to kind of really talk about something that Clevelanders just may not be as aware of, unless if you call it the Car Museum.
I will say, while I haven't been inside the building before, there's a very big presence online.
Yeah, and that's been growing. In our new marketing manager, she's been doing a great job, especially on Instagram. It's really, you've seen really a modernization of our Instagram over the last 5 years.
Right.
As well. And I think Sarah's just knocking it out of the ballpark, what she's doing.
Right. It was good to talk to her too, because I reached out first to Jangela, who was I think the head person, right?
Yeah, the director of the Cleveland History Center.
And then she told me about Sarah, and then Sarah brought me to you, which was rather perfect. And then Sarah's like, "Oh, if you have any questions, let me know." I was like, "Oh wow, wow! I can't believe you're taking this time just to address me personally." Most people just go, here's that person, bug off.
And there's almost so much online that it's really hard to know where to start.
Yeah, and it's not just a lot of people know Hale Farm and Village and not realize that's a part of the Historical Society.
Right.
And, it has such a presence in the Akron area. But, yeah, it's one of our sister sites that I've been down there in the past working and helping out. And most of our staff up here in Cleveland goes down to help out with the Civil War reenactment, which is one of the biggest Civil War reenactments in Ohio now.
Right.
And there's a lot to cover. I mean, just on this site, why we had to add the identity of the Cleveland History Center, that we had the big problem that the genealogists and researchers, they thought of the whole place as the library. And even Google, for a while on Google Maps, it just said library over the whole entire organization. The Car Museum has always kind of been thought of as separate, but it's been part of the museum since 1963. And we opened this building in 1965. And then we have the two mansions. We have the costume collection. So there's 9 different buildings that make up this location, with the extensions and different things that we've built on over the years. And unfortunately, too many people would identify with just their one part. And it was a struggle just to get them to walk around, and even staff that they kind of hover in their area, but get them to see the whole entire operation that we have. So it's definitely something we're striving to do more. And then we have our other sites, like Shandy Hall out in Ashtabula, which isn't open to the public, but it's one of the oldest. It's an 1815 frame house, the oldest frame house in the Western Reserve, and believed to be one of the oldest frame houses in Ohio, which, if you don't know what a frame house, it's that next step after a log cabin that now, instead of building that immediate shelter like the early pioneers did, now we have the time to have finished wood to put the house together. And it's got great War of 1812 connections, a person that built the home and lived there. And it was lived in by 4 generations of the family, and 90% of what's in the home is original to that family.
Really?
Yeah, it's really, and I'm one of the last people here at the museum that worked in interpretation and gave tours and did the events out there. And it is a little isolated. It's about a mile past Unionville Tavern, but it's, because that was my first kind of way to get extra hours as a part-time museum educator.
Right.
I just always, and because it's been such a small group that worked out there, that's probably one of my favorite spots. We used to operate Lawnfield, President Garfield's home out in Menor.
Oh, yeah, sure.
And almost all the stuff inside the house and the collections are still the Western Reserve Historical Society's collections. The Garfield collection is one of our premier collections that we have. But it was just one of those nice things that National Park Service, and being a presidential home, they took over the grounds and then the staffing. So they're all park rangers. And a lot of our former coworkers now are rangers out at Lawnfield. But yeah, I mean, to go on our website, there is a lot of what we cover. And that's when you've been around for over 150 years and your Cleveland Central Collection Agency. It's the beauty of the beast that we have all that stuff.
Absolutely. I too have a personal problem with Google though, because one thing is that when you Google the Cleveland podcast, we don't show up too often. We're going to fix that though real soon. So that way we'll be up there. We'll be the top Google results. So that way people will know. Whenever you associate Cleveland, it will be the Cleveland podcast will be the first thing that you find, even more than the Cavs. Right, Caesar?
That's right. We're going to be the most Googleable thing on the internet.
I feel like we can be.
Right.
But
I have a question. You were talking about the Western Reserve just a minute ago. It's one of the things when I first moved to this city, I heard that term thrown around a lot, and I had no idea what it meant. Can you explain what exactly the Western Reserve is?
Yeah, and I do an hour lecture and actually on this, so we're going to do the quick version.
We have some other questions too.
Yeah,
so maybe
try to keep me on the shorter version of this. But basically, it goes back to colonial America when Connecticut got their royal charter from King Charles II. It had very defined north, eastern, and southern boundaries, but because of the surveying and the spreading, at the time they weren't surveying, but they didn't really know what the whole continent was like then because of the Allegheny and Appalachian Mountains. But then also that question of the native indigenous people that were in those areas, the western boundaries were really left broad. So a lot of those colonies would interpret their colony going across the entire continent. And if you trace the northern and southern boundaries of Connecticut, it runs through northeastern Ohio. So, Hamilton's the buzzword right now. People know the Hamilton play. You might think of one of the big things Hamilton did for the country was figure out the war debt. So, the wars, this is a problem that the English court system never figures out. It goes all the way to the first government under the Articles of Confederation. And this is right around the Northwest Territories being organized. But they're saying that these states give up their western land claims. Connecticut receives about 3 million acres of land in northeast Ohio, and the first thing they can do is pay off their war debt. The second thing they can do is any extra money they get in that sale goes into a fund, and today the Connecticut public schools are still partially funded off that interest from the sale of this land in northeast Ohio.
Wow.
And
if you went to Connecticut today, would things be named Western Reserve?
No,
there as well?
That's the name because it was Connecticut's Western Reserve.
Okay.
So you will find records, and if you go to the Connecticut Historical Society and some of their genealogy and historical organizations, what you'll more likely to find is their city names match here in Northeast Ohio because we were founded by those New Englanders. And the other big footprint you see is our town structure, the fact that we have Public Square downtown. And my family's out from Lake County, Painesville, Chardon, all those main towns we have, Oberlin out west, all are based on a New England town plan because that's the people that were buying the land. So basically Connecticut sold that land off to a land company, and then it becomes a real estate venture. So the early pioneers that are coming out here, like Moses Cleveland, the person the city's named after, he was an investor. He led the surveying party in 1796. So when you see the Cleveland city flag, that's our founding date as a city. And it really is a investment by this group of people, these landowners now back in Connecticut. And then the pioneers are going to the different, like Simon Perkins was a land agent for the Akron era, and he's kind of known as the father of Akron or the grandfather of Akron. And that's how you see that develop. But it's more, you see the Western Reserve name here in this area, but it gets very antiquated that by 1803, Ohio has enough population to become a state. And really the Western Reserve now just becomes a antiquated name. Western Reserve University merges with Case in 1967. So that's why, and that's another confusing thing that people sometimes I see on the internet, Case Western Reserve Historical Society, that they don't get all these different names, but it's more of a place name you see out here.
So this is the far west edge of the Western Reserve. Is that right?
We're right in the middle of it. So the Western Reserve basically goes from the Ohio-Pennsylvania border out to Sandusky is the far western edge. So that's that area that they also call the Firelands. And working in history as long as I have a lot of Cleveland pet peeves, I call them, over the years. And one is everyone thinks that the whole Western Reserve is land given to soldiers as payment for the war, which, Southern Ohio, we had a Virginia military district that did pay payment for the soldiers. And then other people say, well, the Western Reserve, that was just people that lost their homes. They gave them land, and that's not true either. The Firelands area, so I went to Bowling Green. Our satellite campus is the Bowling Green Firelands campus. It's that western edge out in Erie and here, I think it's Erie and Huron are the two counties. And when you look at some of the older maps, they're divided up a little bit different.
Right.
And again, the Firelands name is antiquated, and you see it, Firelands Winery and like the BG campus. But just like the Western Reserve, it's more like a business name or organizational name, like the university or the historical society.
I actually know a little bit about how the original colonies had the huge swath of land that was technically theirs. I remember looking at a map, and I'm looking at Virginia, and I'm going, wait, that's going all the way to California. And I go, wow, like, man, Virginia was huge. And all of a sudden you go, wait. They claimed all the lands all the way out in California. I'm thinking about it and going, wait, that's owned by the Spanish. Screw it all. We're just going to own this part of California, even if the Spanish are there.
Yeah, so same thing with Connecticut. I mean, it went all the way to the Pacific, and then later on, it was the Mississippi River became the dividing line for that western boundary. But it's the early Articles of they actually got some work done during the Articles of Confederation period. The big one was the Northwest Territory,
right?
And it was a year before that was finalized was when the agreement with Connecticut was made for the Western Reserve.
So I guess the big summary of this is that for those who live in Ohio, you are 1 degree removed from 50 Cent because he lives in Connecticut. And since we're connected to Connecticut, we're 1 degree removed from 50 Cent. Therefore, you too can be part of G Unit, our sponsor for today's podcast.
We don't have a sponsor.
But G Unit would be interesting. Is like G Unit sneakers. Oh no, what's 50 Cent's new thing? He's got an alcohol or some sort. But anyway, that's a little bit of a tangent. You talked about Moses Cleveland, right? Mm-hmm. The founder of our city, the person that the city is named after. So then, what was it? Because he was just the main investor around here in this for the city boundaries, or was it how did they pick? This Moses guy, we should name a city after him.
So it goes back to the surveying party then. He is a member of the Connecticut Land Company. He's not the biggest investor, but he's one of the top ones. And he's selected because he was an officer during the Revolutionary War. And when you have a surveying party, it's actually made up of 52 people that came out that summer. So he was used to leading groups of people. And then he also had to negotiate, because the other question we've talked about this whole time, just like you talked about the Spanish in California, what about the indigenous people that own the land or have the land in this area? So because of his work in the Revolutionary War, he had to negotiate with the Iroquois Nation who controlled the land east of the Cuyahoga River. And that was a big thing that he led the surveying party, came out here, negotiated with the Iroquois Nation who controls this land. And then once it's pretty amazing. They made it to Conneaut, the far northeastern edge of the Western Reserve on July 4th. So the first thing they do is have a party, like any good American would do, with salutes and shooting your gun because we don't have firecrackers back then, and drinking lots of rum. Right. And then they broke into two parties. One party had to find the southern boundary. So they basically just went down the Ohio-Pennsylvania border. And I think it's the 41st parallel is that southern boundary they had to look for. And they're using the stars and they're measuring the stuff by hand. But Moses Cleveland, with some of the other party, follows the lake and boats to find the Cuyahoga, that they know this is the big river in this area. And that's why Cleveland's kind of right in the middle of the map of the Western Reserve. Right. And traditionally, kind of, if you think of we got the lake effect snow going on right now, the radar map, that's pretty much the Western Reserve you're looking at every time we see the radar maps. And then they plot, and we have one of our maps in Cleveland starts here, is the original map of downtown. It's got Public Square. It's got the original, Ontario, Superior, Erie Street. So right across from Progressive Fields, the Erie Street Cemetery, if people don't understand. It was 1906 when we switched the name streets to number streets in the city. But yeah, they plotted that out. And if you, in that presentation, when I do the history of this area, we actually have a Google map that one of our old senior historians, Dr. Pershey, put together that lays this Google map on that original map, and it lines up almost identically. And it shows how accurate they were doing that surveying as well, that the river, it looks perfect. And it's one of our cooler things I think we have in the collection.
I can't imagine on days like today where it's, like 2 feet of snow? Is that what we got every night?
Oh, 2 feet?
That's the area down here in University Circle. We only got 3 inches.
Okay.
That's snow. That's that snow belt.
a bunch of Toastmaster friends of mine go, yeah, my kids are out of school today, and they go, oh, it's because you're out in Chesterland.
But I can't imagine a winter time in pioneer times.
No, and actually, going back, another map that we have, and this is why the importance of the surveying party is, they originally thought the shoreline was going to be horizontal, so that would have significantly reduced the amount of snow on the east side. And, I grew up in Lake County, just on the edge of the snow belt, had family down in Geauga and that area, though, where they probably do have 2 feet of snow right now. And so the surveyor, when they came and surveyed, they actually found out we had that diagonal shoreline that pretty much from Cleveland up to Buffalo goes on that diagonal. And we always remember in Cleveland, to put it in perspective, we don't have it as bad as Buffalo. I know they got it a lot worse with snow than we do right now.
And so the prevailing westerlies come across, right, from the west, and they pick up the moisture off of the lake. All that comes as snow and just dumps on Buffalo and the east side of Cleveland and Erie, Pennsylvania.
And part of it's the elevation, too, of Chardon and Geauga County, because that's the foothills of the Alleghenies right there. And it's always that term they say where Cleveland and Ohio, it's really where the Midwest meets the East Coast. But and that goes back to the glacier that formed this land originally, the Wisconsin Glacier. So, this goes back tens of thousands of years, why we have that ridge. And basically, all the ridge roads throughout northeastern Ohio, that was the ridge of where the glacier ended. And because of their elevation and that moisture picking up off those westerly winds, creates this lake effect. And we're one of the few places in the world that have it.
So if you're really looking to blame someone for the weather, blame the Wisconsin Glacier. Speaking of glaciers, though, fun fact about, I guess, good old Fred, the mud monster. Yes, this mud monster had the opportunity to stand on top of a glacier. True story.
Where at?
In Alaska. I can't remember the exact name of the glacier, but you have to take a helicopter up, and then they give you little snow boots, and they have special spikes on them. And every time you go through this glacier, you see these big holes, and the tour guide goes, "Yeah, don't go through those holes. You'll be dead." And it's like, "Oh, wow, thanks for the tips." It's like, "Oh, no problem. We found someone in there." I was like, wait. So the point of the story is, thank God we don't have a glacier around here anymore. But also, darn that glacier, we got so much snow now. But going into a little bit, you talked a little bit about the surveying party, and then this with Moses Cleveland, and then you mentioned the Iroquois, which I think might translate well to the name of our county, Cuyahoga. How does that come about? I'm pretty sure it's based on the Iroquois, correct?
We're not really sure. It's not. Oh. It's actually not the Iroquois language. So even though the Iroquois, we believe there's this group called the Erie people, and a lot of the names they think might come from the Erie people. But unfortunately, that's prehistory, and you have archaeologists that are slowly learning that. But we don't have records of exactly what they were like. And then, of course, as the European traders come through, the languages start to change. So Cuyahoga, of course, means Crooked River. It's the name of the river that the county takes its name from. But what ends up happening when the Europeans first come to North America, one of the first interactions with the indigenous is trading. And what ends up happening is later on over the years, the different tribes start battling. And so in the 17th century, you have a series of what's known as the Beaver Wars. And basically the result is the Iroquois nation, or thought of it, pretty much exterminated this Erie people who are believed to be closer to the Delaware nation. So why the Iroquois? Because most people think they're upstate New York, Pennsylvania, but it's kind of this confederacy of tribes. Ends up becoming the dominant tribe. So the names go a little further back. We did have established tribes like the Wyandot that were west. And by far, I am not an expert on the native tribes, but that's where the Erie is believed to come from that as well. Geauga County, it's believed to be the name Raccoon. But I'm pretty sure it's not the Iroquois language. It's that older language that then got changed over the years as they met the European traders and, and all the different dialects people have that you slowly start to get the name changes. And then the other tricky thing is spelling that, and that's why Moses Cleveland's name is spelled different than the city of Cleveland is because, and one of those pet peeves I mentioned earlier, is the story about why Cleveland doesn't have the A anymore. And a lot of people say it's because the newspaper couldn't fit the whole name Cleveland. They drop, unfortunately, and Cleveland starts here. The first newspaper that was in Cleveland was called the Cleveland Herald, so we have that on display. It has the A in there. And we had a director in the 1940s that wrote somebody wrote to him, and I think it's about a 10, 15-page paper, but he basically went and researched all the newspapers, all the atlases. And newspaper to newspaper, not just in this area, but across the country, it would be spelled different from issue to issue or within the same issue. Spelling just was not as formal. And also, you're typesetting by hand.
Right, which is so much harder.
Yeah. And there was a newspaper in 1831 that it was an editorial decision that they wanted to drop the A just to go for the shorter.
Because it looks cool.
And that, of course, doesn't mean the city changes its name at that point. It's not as fun. A couple of years later, we gain enough population to go from village to city, and we have the first city charter from 1836, and that's the date of when we are now the city of Cleveland, and that's how we end up shortening the name.
That's also fascinating.
And I always like to say to the school kids that, the Cavs and Cleveland State University, it's all spelled wrong.
It is interesting, huh? So then I guess transitioning a little bit. So then obviously we have this extensive history of the origins of Cleveland where you can talk for hours and hours on end. I wish I knew as much, but you have to ask me about Roman history and Harlem Renaissance art for that to work. That's my specialties. So then I guess like some more broad questions. What is Cleveland historically most known for? What is that one thing? What's the namesake of Cleveland really? And not just Moses Cleveland, but what is that thing that Cleveland's like, yeah, that's what they did?
Well, I think unfortunately, most of the people in another great group I get to work with is Elder Hostel that comes through Cleveland a couple times a year. And these are 30 people from around the United States of America, retirees that come to the city for a week to see our arts and culture, see everything that Cleveland has. But when I do that early history talk with them, and unfortunately the answer I get the most is, you were the joke of the country in the 70s, 80s. You watch any film from back then, any comedy, and there's the worst city you could end up in, it's going to be Cleveland, and it's the river fire. Most people think of the river fire, which ended up spawning nationally the clean water movement, the Earth Day movement, the EPA. So because of Carl and Lewis Stokes, the one exhibit that we have on display, those two brothers were in office, and they saw how we were becoming that national butt of jokes, but it became a success story. And I think that was really great that last year was the 50th anniversary of the last, and that 69 river fire was not the first river fire.
Oh, no.
It caught on fire 13 different times. But Cuyahoga was the river of the year, the American River of the Year. I forget what organization that was. But that's probably one. The second thing is probably our industry. Steel, John D. Rockefeller, and you really look at the Industrial Revolution. Cleveland's, the illuminating company, the best location in the nation. We really were during the Gilded Age, that best location in the nation. That we were close to the iron ore fields up in the upper Midwest. We were close to the coal in West Virginia and Pennsylvania. We're close to the oil fields. And we see all that industry, like Sherwin-Williams, that's a big news story. They're over 150 years old. They're staying here in Cleveland. Right. But that all develops because of the location of the city, to all those goods that are around, the natural resources and then the goods that get transformed. And then you get to the automobile and the airplane age. Right. Cleveland, that's when we're the fifth largest city in the country. We're the home of the national air races from 1929 to 1949. We're that landing space between New York and Chicago. Again, all the railroads have to come through Cleveland. Right. All the airplanes have to land. And that's also why we have the car museum. We were the world's motor capital from 1895 to about 1908. So
Wasn't the first car made here, technically?
Not the very first car. That's an American invention that we lag behind. Really, Germany and France are the two countries that fight over the first automobile. In America, we have the Duryea brothers in Massachusetts are credited as the first Americans with an automobile, and we do have a Duryea in the collection that's on display in the Upper Crawford. But we have a pioneer named Alexander Winton, and we have a nice display about Alexander Winton. And he's credited with having the first auto showroom. That before this, cars are made from start to finish. They're pretty much custom made for the buyer. Right. Where he had so much faith in his engineering ability that he just kept building cars, so he had to sell them. So he's credited with having the first showroom. And then to advertise his cars, he did things like drive from Cleveland to New York City. Well, we don't have the turnpike to travel on back then, of course. So he drives from Cleveland to Buffalo and then traces the old Erie Canal down to New York City and does this trip in 1897. Cars are so new. nobody really responds to it. And a couple years later, a Plain Dealer reporter convinced them to do the trip again. And this time it was a PR stunt. So they actually telegraphed all the towns they were going to travel through, created this buzz.
Right.
And that was front page paper that people weren't sure, can you make it from Cleveland to New York on a car? So that showed actually that the car isn't just a fad. It's not a rich person's toy. It's
not just cranking the thing and going, oh, geez, it needs to be cranked again for the upteenth time, and you're going 4 miles per hour.
Yeah, so think about that trip that he took from Cleveland all the way up to Buffalo to Albany. And that really started to launch it. And then he broke land speed records. That was his other way. So out in Clifton, it was the first paved street in Cleveland. He broke the land speed record there. In the Glenville.
Oh, really? What was the land speed record?
I think that was in the 60s at that time. And then down at Ormond Beach, Florida, which is close to Daytona Beach, where we have the Daytona 500 now. He raced on the hard sand beach. And I think that time he got it up to 90 some miles an hour. And those early land speed cars are at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. is the Winton Bullet number 1 and 2. That we have had on display here at the museum at times. But it's that Clevelander that's really showing that the automobile can be a practical tool now. And we end up having between 70 to 100 auto manufacturers, 70 in the city itself, over 100 throughout northern Ohio.
Really?
And that's how it really, until Detroit kind of takes over the industry in the 19-teens and Henry Ford's work with the assembly line, that we really see where the presidents, the cars the presidents are driving are made here in Cleveland. And we're really known for that auto industry and had some of the finest cars.
So in other words, Detroit has lied to us this whole time because we are the true kings of cars. We should have GM in our city. And that is another sponsor of ours, GM. Built for tough.
We don't have sponsors.
Well, that's all well and good. We're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to talk more about the museum itself. Hello, I'm Fred. You may know me as many things. Mud Monster, sexiest mud monster in the world, sexiest mud monster in the universe. But more importantly, I'm desperate.
What's the URL again?
TheClevelandPodcast.com.
Do I need to type in www?
Sure.
Do I need to type in http://mark/mark?
Yes. You can follow us at the website, or you can like us on Facebook, like our posts, and share them. And please do respond to the questions. Poor Caesar is typing at 1 letter per hour. He needs new green leaves, and we can't get that without money. So please, make us big so that way Caesar can get better salad and can type better.
The URL is wrong.
Type it again.
HTTP: not semicolon.
That's right, Caesar.
www. The Cleveland Podcast .com. Oh, I found it. I love this website. It takes me everywhere I need to go.
We are back with Chad Malkamaki.
Excellent.
That's right. This last name is not Hawaiian. It is Finnish. Well, actually, what part of Finland?
The western part, the Vasa area, but a little bit further. It was more of the farming area. And trust me, I butcher Finnish words too. So, and then one of the cool things is we actually have a couple of guys on our genealogy committee. These are volunteers that work with us and also do a lot of the workshops. And as soon as I started and they saw my last name, they were all excited. And, these are guys our dad's age. But they've been great to know over the years. Right. And as soon as I see them, we're always talking and stuff, and they're always correcting me on my pronunciations. But I think the town is where my great grandfather was born was Eastaro. It's Y-L, like a lot of Finnish words, a bunch of consonants right in together.
Right. I think my family's just a bunch of Italians and Germans. That's our heritage. As my family always says, we're a bunch of horse thieves and farmers. That's pretty much the summary of our history. But in reality, it's actually a lot more exciting than that. But we came here, and then actually one of my relatives, you can find her name etched on Ellis Island.
Very cool.
So, that's really cool to look at. It's like, whoa, like that's like my great grandmother, and every time I go, and it's like, no one talks about it though. No one mentions, oh, by the way, your great grandmother has her name on Ellis Island at the park, but it is all pretty interesting. But it's so basically the point of this is that Chad's family is not necessarily from Helsinki.
Helsinki is not the only city in Finland, and we're not from the Sami culture. That we don't. It's not the Lav culture anymore,
right?
But it's a Sami culture that not everyone's. It's either or you're from the big city or you're herding reindeer. Connecting it back to the city, the Cleveland International Film Festival. And one of the things I always look for is either Finnish or Scandinavian films. And there was a real interesting one that was called Sami Blood. And it was a Swedish film, but because the culture is through Norway, Sweden, Finland, parts of Russia. Yeah. And it's amazing culturally what they had to go through. Like as a Finn, I think I just saw that Finland's finally up to 5.5 million people in the whole entire world. And it's one of those forgotten countries a lot of time that when you tell someone you're Finnish, even they have no clue. They couldn't identify it on a map or know any or ever meet one. And then the fact that we have such a rich community here in Lake County and Ashtabula County, and then as we were talking earlier, throughout the Upper Midwest. Yeah, I feel as a Finn that Finnish American, it's a forgotten group of people, and then you have this subgroup of the indigenous group from a different part that it even gets treated a different way.
Which is just so rough, But I remember just going through Finland, and I remember one of my most prominent memories was having a crepe that had reindeer meat in it. So every time I go around, be like, I think I've told this story before, but my family joke around, be like, "We're eating Rudolph," and so that was very cruel. My mother certainly did not forgive us for that, and I think the public didn't forgive us either when we're just singing that we're eating Rudolph the red-nosed reindeer. I don't think the Helsinki crowd appreciated us saying that. I don't think they liked that idea at all. But anyway, going back to Cleveland itself, though, and more specifically, the Western Reserve Historical Society that we're still in with all the books. By the way, is this all the volumes of one particular set? Is it like encyclopedias?
No, so you see a lot of encyclopedias. So that's basically, these are books to fill up the bookshelves. That these are duplicates of some of the cool ones. My favorite section, because this is our meeting room that we're in right now.
Oh, okay.
And one cool thing, right to the right of me, that's a fake door. It's a fake door. Yeah, if you look closely at it, those are just some world classics. But there's a little door handle, and we actually open it up and use it sometimes. And it accesses right out to the main parlor on the other side of the room.
It's like something out of Scooby-Doo.
It's a lot of duplicate books we have in here, but there is one of my favorite characters in Cleveland history, and it was his wife that built our second home, because we have two mansions here at the Cleveland History Center, is John Hay. It's the John Hay papers, and then John Hay was one of Lincoln's private secretaries, and we also have the John Hay and Nikolai. They were one of the first main biographers. It's a 10-volume set on the life of Lincoln based on Lincoln's papers, because they were his two private secretaries in the White House. And then John Hay had an amazing career. He was a poet. He served in the U.S. Diplomatic Corps, was Secretary of State under William McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt, and passed away in office. But his wife was a native Clevelander, and she was returning to Cleveland. And she wanted to be closer to her sister, Flora Stone Mather. We have the Flora Stone Mather Memorial and the old women's college at CWRU. It was named after her. And unfortunately, Flora passed away while the house was being built, and she never lived in it. And then it was one of the steel magnates So that's the tough thing with our two mansions, that they have two names because both of them have a similar story. One family built it, but then a second family lived there. But yeah, so I just always have been fascinated by John Hay and the Gilded Age and Marcus Hanna. And I actually, one of the interesting parts of the career, I portrayed John Hay and Marcus Hanna doing not first person, but third person, because it's really tough to do first person interpretation.
So tricky.
So we would call it third person, and we called it the Truth of the Time Sliders because you could slide through time. And it was nice that you could answer modern questions. It's not like when you're in first person at Williamsburg or Hale Farm and Village, where you're confined by that time period. And
right.
You know, what is a car? I don't understand that vehicle you came in. Where third person, at least you could kind of try to give that answer in a way.
Right.
So for our 2004 every 4 years presidential exhibit, I was able to be Marcus Hanna leading people through the galleries in the exhibit. And then for Millionaires Row, we did a second Millionaires Row exhibition in 2005, and I was able to portray John Hay and give those guided tours. So that was another period of my career here, was doing the costume and interpretation.
What are some things that if somebody's visiting Cleveland, what are some historical sites that they could see?
The Soldiers and Sailors Monument downtown.
Right.
It's dedicated to not just the soldiers and sailors, but also the women. The Women's Aid Society, there's a great bronze in there, and just the artwork and the history of that. I think that's a great starting spot. In Sandusky, out in Put-in-Bay, in the Western Reserve, I'm going to answer that as a Western Reserve thing.
Sure.
But the Perry Peace Memorial, because that's the only war documented in the historical period in Cleveland, at least. That's the closest fighting we've had to the city of Cleveland after those original pioneers came out.
Which was a battle on Lake Erie, right?
Lake Erie, yeah.
And it looks like a lighthouse, but it's actually a monument.
Yeah, a huge monument, great views from the top of it, and a statue that used to be on Public Square in Cleveland is there. And we have here at the Cleveland History Center, we have the artist maquette, which is the original plaster that's made, that then the stone carvers made the marble statue. And then if you've been downtown by the courthouse, where we have the Jesse Owens statue, there's another bronze now. Oliver Hazard Perry. So he's not just a Great Lakes Brewing Company beer.
Right.
That's the Commodore that had that decisive victory that enabled America to maintain control over the Great Lakes with Canada. It's why we're not British and part of, like Canada, part of the British Commonwealth.
Are there any buildings that stand out to you?
Gray's Armory downtown, and they're a great organization. That one of my favorite events that we host is the regional competition for History Day, which was founded at Case Western Reserve University in the history department. It's now a national competition that's through all 50 states and American territories. But the Grays, really the volunteer group that runs the museum at the Gray's Armory. So if you've ever seen that castle as you're heading to Progressive Field or the Rocket Mortgage Fieldhouse now, they preserve the memory of this militia that was in Cleveland to protect us, because we talked about we're that first westward expansion of the United States. We were isolated before the canals and railroads came through. If something happened, we needed to have our own military force. So right outside the room we're in right now, we have a painting of when the Grays marched on Public Square for the first time in 1839.
Right.
But that building, it's a great group of volunteers that tell that history. And then they support our History Day students and military prizes and History Day itself, it's like a science fair for history students. So that's coming up in a couple weekends where we're one of the biggest regions in the state of Ohio. And we actually place a lot of national place winners from Northeast Ohio as well. So it's something we take a lot of pride in, because we are the home of History Day, where it was founded. But that's another building. Lawnfield, and these are my personal favorites.
Sure.
Lawnfield, got to go down to Hale Farm and Village. And I know that's one of our sites, but we have 33 buildings that are preserved that otherwise would have been torn down. And it shows that early New England architecture. But it also has Jonathan Goldsmith, who was really the first prominent Western Reserve architect. So that right there in that one site, you have all that. And then Stan Hewitt, and the education director at Stan Hewitt's one of my friends and mentors, that he was in the education department here when I started out.
And that's close to Akron?
Yeah, close to Akron. It's in Akron. And that is one of the old rubber magnets homes, the Sieberling family from Goodyear.
Ah, right.
Yeah.
Right. So then I guess going back into the museum itself and this talking about some of the exhibits. So obviously, we can't have a full podcast in the Western Reserve Historical Society without talking about some of the exact things that can be found here, because we're hoping that by the end, some of our listeners who may be living here may be able to actually attend this museum and see some of the wonderful things that can be found in it. Wouldn't that be good?
Oh, I mean, it's exactly. We need more people in Cleveland to come here and appreciate what we have. And we're mentioning off the air that once people get in the doors here, almost every single visitor is blown away by what they see and just the amazing collections that we have.
So then let's begin with some of the exhibits. So we first have the Carl and Lewis Stokes Making History. You briefly mentioned in the previous half about how the brothers were really kind of playing a part in the river burning saga in regarding the creation of the EPA. So you can thank Cleveland for Donald Trump rolling back the EPA, because it all started here and then Donald Trump rolled it back. So, Cleveland, place where hippies can find pride.
Are you looking at me? Am I hippie?
No, I'm just looking at you because I needed to have someone to just address that line to.
I'm kind of a hippie.
Well, Carl and Lewis Stokes, even though they're from the 60s, you would not want to call them hippies. They were groundbreakers. Carl was the first African-American mayor, not just of Cleveland, but of any major city in the United States of America.
The namesake for the Lewis Stokes Transit Center, right?
That's his older brother.
The older brother.
Yeah,
okay.
So that's Lewis, who is a congressman who served in Congress for 15 terms, so over 30 years, serving the east side of the city of Cleveland. But his younger brother, Carl, in 1967, so they're right at the same time period.
Right.
So you have our mayor here in Cleveland and then his older brother in Washington really having the double-fisted effort of getting that legislation passed through.
Right.
When we get back to the river fire. But, Carl, one of his cabinet members, there's an image in the display, and Norm Krumholtz just passed away. But he did a lot with city planning in the city of Cleveland. And he really, at the Levin School down in Cleveland State, is a very prominent figure. And I was able to get to meet him. And when we were walking through the exhibit, he said, this is probably one of the most dramatic things to sum up Carl's career. And it's the diversity of how he diversified the cabinet. That he said before the image, it just would have been all white males working in the city government. And Carl really started to change that and opened it up and got more of the people that were living here having an active role in their government. And then it was actually his work when he was in the State General Assembly. He realized that the black vote was being gerrymandered and these are still topics we're talking about in the 21st century.
Right.
But he fought, and the Supreme Court ruled that the black vote was being gerrymandered. They had a large enough population, and by that time, when the legislation finally passed, Carl was already mayor, so he wasn't going to resign as mayor to run for Congress. So the ideal person, and there was a couple different figures, but his older brother Lou ends up being. Lewis never wanted to be a politician. He was a civil rights attorney. So another amazing person I was able to meet working on the different exhibits over the years, and he recently just passed away. But I mean, with school groups again, I always mention how we just went through the whole impeachment thing and how that was on the news and trying to bring that history alive to the students and that connection. Well, Lou served, he was the chairman. So he was that guy on the TV for two really significant House investigations. One was the House Select Committee that investigated Dr. Martin Luther King and the JFK assassination in the 70s. But then in the 80s, he was the chairman of the Iran-Contra, the House committee that investigated that, and he was the guy that grilled Ollie North. So I mean, that was he told and both brothers were veterans, and he told Colonel North at the time that he tarnished the uniform that he so proudly wore as a veteran during World War II. And just I think for I was a kid when that was going on, didn't realize that was our guy from Cleveland really pushing that through. And so these were two, not just local, but really nationally significant politicians.
I was just a mere abstract thought at the time of the Iran-Contra incident. They didn't even know what my name was going to be yet until many years later. But that's really interesting. So then obviously this is talking about the history of their lives. And then what exactly else is it? Is there memorabilia? Are there maybe, just things from personal items in that exhibit? Or is it more just covering the history of like letters and...
So the artifacts are, we have Congressman Stokes's desk on display. And in 2006 and 2007, we had a much larger exhibit, but this is a permanent exhibit now that's in the museum. And it's really that it opened before Cleveland Starts Here, but it really kind of, I look at, continues that Cleveland Starts Here, our core Cleveland exhibit, and tells that whole story. But it's a lot of, we have the Carl and Louis Stokes papers here at the museum. So amazing. It's a lot of the images from their collection are up on the wall. And it tries to tell, these two amazing men's stories. And it starts out with their family's migration. During the Great Migration from Georgia. Both their parents came from Georgia. Unfortunately, their father passed away at a very young age, and their single mother had to raise them. And she always told them to become somebody, you need an education. And as Congressman Stokes always said, it's a story that really could only happen in America, that they went to public schools, lived in public housing. The Othwaite homes were one of the first public housing units in the entire country that we have that here in Cleveland. And then served in the war, used his GI money to pay for his education. He was a grad from Western Reserve, went to Cleveland Martial Law, and then ended up going from being a civil rights lawyer to then serving the community as a congressman. And it's really what government can do for you and help you out. And so we kind of tell that story. There's oral histories that this was a joint exhibit with Tri-C. And there was a students that did an oral history project. So we have two monitors that have videos of their lives, but also a video that I think there's got 30 to 40 different individuals and their remembrances of the brothers and their legacy.
Right. Well, that's amazing. I always would look at the Stokes name and the namesake all over the city. And I actually know quite a few city councilmen who would talk about how they met like Lewis, I think in particular. I can't remember. Was Carl died?
96.
96.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, some of them have met him. Some of the councilmen that I have ran into in my lifetime, because I still am decently politically active in just being a community person. And I remember just running across all these councilmen and they would say, man, Stokes would be so disappointed to see the way that the city is now. And I go, who are they? And so it's great to have this exhibit so that way you can talk about arguably the two most important brothers, the most important brother pair that we have in our city, and it's in its history.
Yeah, they're one of the brothers. There's a couple of them out there. But yeah, I mean, they're so important with what they did, not just locally, again, nationally. The legacy, even President Obama knew the story of the Stokes brothers and used that to help inspire even his campaign in 2008. And it really is this national story that really goes across the American experience. And it's just great that it's a permanent part of what we have here at the museum.
Which is amazing. So then talk about the next one, which is, I guess, the natural transition. Cleveland Starts Here. You said this is where the Carl Louis Stokes and this exhibit kind of are hand in hand and right next to each other almost.
Yeah, that's our core experience. That we want you to really, we want to be the place that you start with Cleveland history. We are the go-to place if you're going to start with Cleveland history. So that's why the exhibit's called that. And it has between the real objects, the reproductions, and the digital interactives, there's over 850 of our items, which is still just a small percentage of the artifacts that we have here in the manuscripts that we have in the archives library. But it tells the whole 200-year history. I mentioned the original map of downtown Cleveland. We have the original newspapers. We have Elliot Ness's postcards when he was safety director of Cleveland. And so there's great drawers that say open and pull out. When you pull them out, you have the scrapbook that he kept and is in our collection. It's turned to when Al Capone, it's one of the Chicago newspapers, when they brought down Al Capone. But then Cleveland brings them in because we were considered the most dangerous city in the country in the early 1930s after all the stuff that was going on during Prohibition.
Right.
But we have this big event in Cleveland called the Great Lakes Expo. And in the Crawford Museum, we have some displays about the Great Lakes Expo. And if you've ever read Devil in the White City about the Chicago's Columbia Expo, there's that serial killer that's in Chicago. And I don't know what it is about World's Fairs or big fairs like this. But we had one in Cleveland known as the Torso Murderer. And it's one of the cases that Elliot Ness was never able to solve. And these postcards are believed to be postcards taunting Elliot Ness that he received the rest of his life. That could be from the person that many believe is the torso killer, but it's never been confirmed. So that's in the exhibit. We've recently received the Superman statue. So we have the great big huge Superman head, and one of the gaps we were in, one of the great things, the way the exhibit was designed was to be able to be changeable, for it to be a living exhibit that we can bring new things in, bring things out. And we recently, it's made out of steel, and it's based on Siegel and Schuster's design from the 1930s. So we got this larger than life-size head. It was going to be a 30-foot tall statue. They were the artist was hoping to put down by the Rock Hall, and was never able to get there. So we're able, he's got them on loan right now with the museum. But those are the newest things we just added to the exhibit. And the Siegel and Schuster Society, which I just found this out, that February 29th is Superman's birthday. So
Really?
come on down to the Cleveland History Center and celebrate Superman's birthday with the Superman statue. Great place to get a selfie taken with Superman.
Oh, that's pretty cool. I didn't know it's February 29th. That means if we're doing leap years, gosh, he must be, because when was Superman born? What was the exact year again? Like 1937?
Right around there. It's right around. And apparently it was after left Siegel and Schuster. Eric Rivette, our chief curator, was telling me that the reason somebody at DC came up with this is why, after how many years, Superman never seems like he ages. And that's because his birthday is on leap day. So it only happens every 4 years. Because, a person doesn't age if they're born on February 29th.
Because I was thinking about it. I was thinking the approximate age would be 19 or 20 years old. Actually, it's kind of funny. I have a couple friends who are born on leap years, and I always say if they ever go to a bar, I go, "Hold on, you're underage. You're only 5 years old."
Maybe that's the deal with the Simpsons too. Maybe they were all born on leap day.
Leap days. Or that's kind of funny too, because you have Superman who leaps buildings in a single bound. I thought maybe that's the joke, like a play on leap day. Leaps and but I like the aging part too. I like the aging aspect. So then after that, there's a couple of other really wonderful exhibits. We talked a little bit about the mansions themselves. We'll go a little bit later into that. And then there's also women in politics.
Yeah, that's going to open. Our big kickoff party is May 22nd. May 23rd is going to be the public opening, but it's going to celebrate women's, from going the suffrage movement to getting the right to vote to actual involvement, like from Frances Payne Bolton, our local congressman. Now, she didn't, this was in the 1940s. She didn't like to be referred to as a congressperson or a congresswoman. She liked to be known as our congressman. And she took over her husband. He passed away in office, and she took over his seat, and then would go on to serve for about over 20 years up until the 1960s. And she really, during World War II, helped make sure the cadet nursing corps was established. She was a nurse, and you got the Frances Payne Bolton School of Nursing at CWRU. But that was one of her passions, helping in Africa in the 1950s. But she's a really prominent Republican politician right here from Cleveland. And we have great images of her with President Eisenhower and the work they were doing in the 1950s on the humanitarian front.
Right. That's pretty amazing. So then I guess one kind of dumbish question, I suppose, going to women politics. I, at one point, was in the Steffi Tubbs Jones Hall at Case Western. And Steffi Tubbs Jones, she was a politician here, correct?
She actually, going back to Louis Stokes, she's who took over Louis Stokes's. She was a county prosecutor, and then she was kind of his chosen successor when he retired from Congress in the 90s. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So that's where the namesake comes from. That's interesting. Okay. Because every time I go, okay, she's a congresswoman, well, I was kind of left a little bit like, well, why is she named? Why is the name of the place that I've lived for 2 years? And then now we know 2 years after I moved out.
And she tragically died in office. Unfortunately, she had a heart attack. She was working, and she was in her car. And so it was a tragic loss that her political career was cut much shorter. So I think that's one of the reasons that she's still remembered, because she was such a strong woman. Right. And was that next successor to Congressman Stokes. And we have the little memorial right across the street from the museum, right on the corner of East 108th and Wade Park.
And then near the Cleveland Star Tier is also the Setting the World in Motion. So then that would be the one with about the cars, correct?
That's the Cleveland connection. So it's Cleveland,
connection.
yeah, how we set the world in motion. So it focuses on the Cleveland side of the auto aviation industry, and then our 3 air race airplanes that we have, and we have a whole section that tells the story.
Right.
We used to, the reason, as a CWRU student, you remember the air show flying over the campus every Labor Day weekend. How does Cleveland end up with a national air show on a holiday weekend?
Right.
It was kind of a nod to us when we were this major racing city. And again, the Hopkins Airport, when it was built, it was the largest airport in the world. It was
Really largest in the world.
And we were that refueling space between New York and Chicago that all that traffic had to stop here in Cleveland. And we had a large aviation industry itself. Besides the airport, we had manufacturers. But first airport that had a flight control tower, first airport connected by municipal rail to the city core. So it brought 100,000 people. This was the Indianapolis 500, the Daytona 500 of air racing. And they did cross-country races that they would fly from California and see who the first to land in Cleveland. And then the premier one was called the Thompson Trophy, which was a closed-course race. So you had 30 airplanes racing around Hopkins Airport. And, of course, when Hopkins was built in the 20s, that was the country. And then unfortunately in the post-war years became a residential area. Those GIs we mentioned earlier, like Congressman Stokes, some of them were using their GI bill to build those homes. Right. And a plane actually did crash into a house. In the 49 race, but the air races themselves, after World War, propeller flown airplanes were not popular. We're getting to the jet age, the space age. So they were losing some money in general. But when you think about it, now with air racing, it's those Red Bull races that are out in the desert or out over water that you don't see the close, because they were exciting. I mean, airplanes crashed, but it was top pilots. Jimmy Doolittle, the general that led the air raid over Tokyo in World War II, he was a Thompson Trophy victory winner, and starlets like Jimmy Stewart and Gloria Swanson, who were into aviation, would come here to Cleveland. We have Amelia Earhart being interviewed on WHK, the local radio station. She participated in the air races and would come as a spectator. So this was like a who's who of aviation. And not just Americans, but also internationally known pilots from with the Third Reich. You had Nazi pilots participating because they were trying to show their military might in the 1930s. Right. The French also, with their aviation corps, were sending pilots out. So this wasn't just national; it was international. And
maybe we shouldn't mention the Third Reich coming here. Maybe not the greatest namesake, but that's all pretty interesting. So then.
I don't think a lot of people realize, including myself before I lived here, how important Cleveland was to the United States at that time, back in the 1930s.
Yeah, I mean, that was really, like I said, going from the Gilded Age really until the 70s. I mean, when you start to see the industrial decline in the city, but that's one of the stories that we want to tell. That this is why so many people moved to Cleveland, how we were one of the largest, and we still have a large population when you look at our U.S. Census area. And pretty much it's the Western Reserve that we talked about earlier and I think it's 1.8 million people still live in Northeast Ohio. But those people were all pulled here. One of our core areas of focus are we have 4 main core areas of focus, but one is entrepreneurship, because one, we have this history of businesses, and we actually host the 100-year club that celebrates businesses that have been here for 100 years. Right. But it also was that pull factor that if it was European immigrants, if it was the Great Migration with African Americans coming from the South, that's how people ended up here in Cleveland, because of those jobs.
Right. And, that's all pretty fast. This is all really just so much here. And then I guess the next exhibit would be Revolution, which I do believe is connected to setting the world in motion, correct?
That's the lower part of the Crawford, and we have 6 different thematic areas. So it's really more the international and other nationally known cars, our oldest cars from 1897. So we really look at that innovation and change in the early years of the auto industry. There's an early 1900 Benz before the company becomes known as Mercedes-Benz.
Interesting.
We do have a gull-wing Mercedes that was owned by Walter Halley from Halley Brothers Department Store. So that's one of those cool ones that, like the DeLorean, opens up above the car. And speaking of the DeLorean, we have the very first DeLorean that ever came off the assembly line. Wow. Also on display with 3 other stainless steel cars. That the DeLorean was the only stainless steel car that you could purchase, but Bethlehem and Allegheny Steel had three cars. It started in the 1930s and continued with a 1960 T-Bird and a 1966 Lincoln. But these are promotional cars, showing the new product of stainless steel. And the slogan was they would never rust, bust, or dust. And there is not a speck of rust on. They do dent.
So part of it's not true, but the rust part.
Not a speck of dust on those cars, or rust on those cars, yeah.
But if you're talking about bust, sorry.
Well, it won't break. You might see a ding here or there.
Yeah, because if you hit it hard enough, almost everything will have a dent. And that is wise words from Fred. So then, again, with Revolution, that's pretty fascinating. And then we have the one thing that perhaps everyone wants to really go around, literally, the Euclid Beach Park Grand Carousel.
109 years old. It's going to turn 110. So every May we have a birthday party when it's Carousel's birthday time. But yeah, 54 of the 58 horses are the original horses. Just between the life of Euclid Beach, when the carousel went up in 1910, the park closes in 1969, and then it gets sold to an amusement park to Maine. And when that park closes down in 96, the carousel comes back for auction. And luckily there's 3 different community partners that were able to pool their money together. And then from the auction to restoration, and then building the new mechanism to safely run the carousel and the pavilion, that was about a $3.1 million project. But it's got the original center pole. So you look at this, amazing center pole, and the whole weight of the carousel sits on that. The 2 original chariots that were on there, and some other decorative pieces. And then we have a great volunteer group that helps us. 2 great volunteer groups, the Grand Carousel Society and then Euclid Beach Park Now, help us either staff with volunteers in the carousel or raise those funds to keep the carousel up and running. And I always like to say it's the oldest thing in the museum you actually get to touch.
And also ride. Yep. So that's kind of a really cool feature too. Not only can you touch it, you can literally put your buttocks on this 1910 relic, and you get to go and you get to ride around the carousel. I forget, is there music that plays as well? There
is music. We do have on loan from the Aveni family. In 1969, it was a family that ended up purchasing the band organ, and unfortunately, with it being over 100 years old, it has to have a certain humidity level to operate it, because it's still got the original bellows underneath it to operate it. So we do throughout the year play the band organ, but the music, if it's the digital music you get to hear off the iPod, it's the actual music from the band organ though. From the CD that was made from the band organ. So it's still the music from Euclid Beach, but when of any band organs playing, I mean, it just knocks your socks off. I remember the first day we had the carousel open, the second floor of the mansion we're in right now, you could hear the music all the way. It was spreading that far, and it sounds like there's a marching band walking through the museum.
That's pretty interesting. Well, I guess it makes sense given it's a carousel with when you're trying to draw those little kids, you want to be loud and be like, kids, look at this, get on the horse and ride. Now we're going to talk about, I guess, one of the last exhibits that kind of came up, which would be where we are now, which is not really, but we kind of are the mansions. Yeah, we are here. Yeah. The Bingham, Hanna, and Hay McKinney. Is it one mansion or 2? There's 2.
It's 2 separate mansions. Yeah. One was acquired in 1938. The other was acquired in 1940. And the Bingham Hanna, it's mostly used for office space for the staff. But we have 2, the dining room and the parlor decorated. And then right off to the side of that is the Chisholm Haley costume wing. We can't forget about talking about our amazing costume collection that right now the exhibit is called Si Jolie, which means so pretty in French. And it goes through the whole history from the 19th century when Clevelanders would have to travel to France to actually get their haute couture fashion. And there's a wonderful Louis Vuitton traveling trunk right in the front part of the display with the dresses, but it continues all the way to when we had Halley Brothers and May Company and Higbee's downtown, that you could get that haute couture fashion in our own backyard. And it's probably one of our top costume collections I've seen our costume curator Patty Abinson put on. And then it's just another collection that we own over 30,000 textile pieces. So not just the dresses. We do have men's clothes. Unfortunately, men's fashion doesn't change too much over time. So we usually end up focusing on women's clothing, but it's everything from hats, shoes, jewelry, quilts, flags. We had a Civil War flag exhibit. But that's a whole other connection. It's right off the side of the one mansion. And then the second mansion, the Hay McKinney mansion, that's the one I mentioned earlier that was built by John Hay's widow, and then the Steele family lived there. But it's really our open storage for our decorative arts that we've had over the years, an American Furniture Collecting Club. And again, we've collected artifacts going back to 1867. And it's also, in my opinion, your only place to see what Millionaires Row was like. So even though this was after Millionaires Row started to decline in the early 20th century, and with transportation, you can live further and further away. The Millionaires Row was on Euclid Avenue from downtown at Public Square out to the University Circle. And on that 4-mile stretch, there was 130 mansions at one time. And out of those 130, there's 4 to 6. And the number fluctuates because some of them have storefronts and apartment buildings, and the original. So there is some original architecture on the outside. It's sandwiched between, but like the Mather Mansion in Cleveland State, that's one of the ones that was Clara Hay's brother-in-law built that, but it's used as a rental facility and it's not really decorated like a mansion. So that's one story our Hay McKinney tells, is it's a way to see what life was like in Cleveland. And a lot of the artifacts and furniture that we have in there was owned by the families on Millionaires Row. But then it also tells the history of decorative arts in America. So each room itself is a particular time period. So ranging from early Ohio and early America room, the Federalist period. We have a Renaissance Revival room, American Empire style, an eclectic bedroom that's more modern, kind of Art Nouveau bedroom with Tiffany glass lamps, and a John Singer Sargent prints in the room as well. But that's really each room you kind of see that evolution of American collecting, but also, like I said, it's viewable storage that if we didn't have the house decorated that way, all that stuff would be in storage.
I saw a map today. It was a drawing of Cleveland in 1877. Do you have that here?
In our library, and that's another whole section we didn't even talk about, is our archives and research library. And we have one of the biggest map collections. So I'm not sure if it's the one you saw specifically, but I know almost every year of map we can find in our archives library, besides the thousands of manuscripts and millions of photographs that we have as well.
Okay.
So what are some of those things in the archives themselves, since it's been conveniently brought up?
Well, my friends in the library would be remiss if I didn't mention them. But it's our family papers. So like I mentioned, well, we have every mayoral administration paper going up to Jane Campbell, and then pretty certain Mayor Jackson's papers will come here as well. We recently just had the George Forbes papers, religious papers, church congregations that no longer exist, but also some congregations that don't have the space for their archives that have been in Cleveland for so long have their collections here. Family genealogy is a huge part. But then we have specific archives. This weekend, we actually have an open house for our African-American archives coming up. And we were one of the first ethnic archives in the country, but we also have Jewish American, Irish American, Italian American, philanthropic, LGBTQ, sports archives, women's archives. So we have special archivists that focus on those different collections and build that up. But really, I mean, it's made up, and we teach the SAGES program for CWRU. And as I mentioned to the students, and I'm like, well, Matt, that you didn't use our archives more. You remember coming here for that one class. But pretty much whatever major, and it seemed like you were more, like you said, Greek and Roman. And
well, actually, my major, I guess now I'm going to have to defend myself. Fred was someone who, although I love Cleveland, my focus in history was really broad. Well, not broad, but it was outside of here. And so my main focus was actually one of my main focuses was the Great Migration. So I did learn quite a bit about Cleveland and the Alabama connection with a lot of the African Americans from Alabama.
Yeah, it was called Alabama North.
Yeah, moving up to the north, and you have like Carl, and then you have like Carl Lewis and like some of the families that came there. And then Ozzie Newsome and others, and so that was a part of it. But then my research, as it got more narrow and more specific, it eventually just became about art during the Great Migration era. And so in particular, I covered Jacob Lawrence.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know if you know who that is, but
Well, and I was going to say, we in the Cleveland Starts here, we have Charles Salee, some of his artwork.
Okay.
And it's it was a painting for the Future Outlook League here in Cleveland. So you actually could have used the library to do some research. And as a student, you actually get free admission once a week as a CWRU student.
Oh, it's funny.
I
can still do it now.
Yeah, if you're in grad school, you can, or doctorate, and you can come and do that research. But yeah, and I was even thinking just on that subject alone, the St. James AME Oral History Project, we have their papers, and it's oral histories of people that came to Cleveland during the Great Migration. But I get you had a more narrow focus on a certain artist. But I always tell the students, no matter what your major, if it's engineering, if it's medical, we have, doctor's papers here in the museum that you could use. Even though it's Cleveland and we are Cleveland focused, a lot of our stuff we have has international aspects to it. So there's almost any subject you could almost find in the library.
And I'll give you an example of how narrow my research got. It got so narrow that even my own professor went, I have no idea about any of the stuff you've covered. But I like it. Because at first it was too broad, and then I got so specific that it was to the point that my research wound up being maybe 1-2 books and a bunch of personal papers from Jacob Lawrence. And it was just like calendars and scrap papers. And I remember everyone else had like 20 sources, and I had like 7 sources. And yet everyone's like, "Hey, this is great research. Good job." And I'm looking at my resource list. I'm like, I'm literally a third of everybody else. This is kind of disappointing. But again, I did get an A in that whole class, so I must have done something right. Something. I don't know. Maybe it's because of my handsome muddy face. I have no idea. But anything else you would like to talk about the Western Reserve Historical Society? The floor is yours.
One of the things that we didn't mention is our kids' exhibits area. I guess that's the one thing we didn't cover. That for families, if a family asks, you have a lot of families, I'm sure they're listening to the podcast, right?
We have people of childbearing age and child producing age, but I don't think we have many parents.
Well, these future parents, think about it. We mentioned the Euclid Beach Carousel to ride, but we also have this whole hands-on experience that, and we've actually seen a lot of our families that as their new families. I mean, kids can start riding the carousel. We've had a week-old baby ride the carousel. Of course, their parents have to hold them on the horse. And,
right.
Of course, that baby, we really encourage them to ride in the chariot. But a lot of families with toddlers, though, they come to the museum, ride the carousel. Down in the lower part of the car museum, we have the replica Tinkerbell, which the real Tinkerbell's on display, and we kind of skipped over that in Revolution. It's a 1965, a guy from Cleveland named Robert Manry sails across the Atlantic Ocean in a 13.5-foot boat.
Really?
And it's during the Cold War, and this ends up becoming international news that's carried all over the country. And in fact, I mentioned the Cleveland International Film Festival a couple of years ago. A guy from Washington knew the story as a kid and made a film that was able to premiere at the Film Fest called Manry at Sea. So the kids can climb in the replica boat and imagine they're Robert Manry going on this crazy 78-day trip in this 13. I mean, it's a tiny, tiny boat called the Tinkerbell. And then they end up in kids exhibits, which is our hands-on history area, where we really encourage kids to learn history through play. So there's a West Side Market food sorting station looking at and it's really cool that we've been able to find, of course, classic play food. We don't have the real food there in a museum. But it's got ethnic foods, but we've been able to match up almost like you're in the market, and it's got a backdrop of the market. But then it goes through, right to that area, how we've cooked. So it's really these series of little mini timelines. So you can see going back to the Native Americans all the way up to using microwaves in the 80s, how we changed the cooking. And we really help the parents. It encourages dialogue and talk. How we dress. It actually has different fabrics that people have used over the years. The map table that shows how Cleveland changed, where we have little blocks that they can put on, and it shows the different churches over 4 different decades and how they changed, the courthouses, hotels, sports venues. The building materials that we use for our homes. So again, one of our phrases we've always used around here is we want people to, take history personally. And especially when you're working with kids, the way they can connect that to their everyday life is really where we're hoping that's going to sink in. So like I said, we're one of those places that I always say for families, from intergenerational dialogue to grandma and grandpa interacting with the kids. But, you got family members, a dad and teenage daughter want to go after the cars. They can look at that. Can go to the costume wing. And really there's something for everybody here at the museum to find and be able to connect with. And like I said, we want people to Cleveland to start here. We want this to be their first stop when they're learning and researching and making those connections.
When do you guys open? Like, what are your hours? 10
to 5, Tuesday through Sunday. Monday is the only day that we're closed.
All right. And where are we located here? We're on East Avenue?
East Boulevard, yeah. We're 10825 East Boulevard here in University Circle.
How much does it cost to visit?
It's $12 for adults, $10 for seniors, and $6 for children. And we also started this year college ID. So if you're a college student with your valid college ID, it's $10.
It's a good deal.
I got one of those. Although I can't get into other buildings on campus, but I can certainly get that discount. With that being all said, we are now going to wrap things up. Thank you so much, Chad. Malkamaki.
Nailed it.
Oh, yeah. I'm getting good at that now. Now I can apply for Finnish citizenship.
This was a lot of good information today.
It was a lot of great information. Thank you so much, Chad. Thank you to all of our listeners. Right now, I'm going to go and find the secret passageway with these books.
There's ghosts in there, I bet.
Yeah, go see some ghosts. Go see all types of wonderful, dusty things.
Smell him a ghost.
That's right, because this is where he actually lives. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Chad. And we will see all of you later.